True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
When things didn't go the way that Raynella Leath wanted, she could be calculating, even vicious. But she could also be pretty charming. After attempting to kill a man who considered her a friend, and after 2 husbands died suspicious deaths, the people where she lived in Solway, Tennessee, wondered about Raynella. Many feared her or even warned others, don't cross Raynella. Raynella is actually a grandmother, formerly married to a state prosecutor. She's quite well off, well educated, and a former director of nursing. It took years for her to go to trial for murder, but despite a conviction, she's now a free woman. Join us at the quiet end for Until Death. This is a complex story of a justice system that was probably influenced by money and privilege, and it's about a woman who may have actually gotten away with murder. Not once, but twice.
So we picked a beer from Tennessee, and I went with Push 88 from Southern Grist Brewing Company. When we visited Nashville, that probably was my favorite brewery. Just a nice place. We really enjoyed it. Push 88 is an American IPA, 7.5% alcohol by volume, cloudy orange color, small white head, a little touch of lace. Very nice citrus fruit aroma. And that's where the taste is. Citrus in terms of orange and tangerine. It's a nice sweet IPA.
Yeah, this is one of the better IPAs I've had, according to my tastes. I really enjoy it. I like the citrus.
You're more into the fruity aspect and not much into the hops. The real aggressively hopped ones don't really trip your trigger too much.
No, and maybe it's an acquired taste because you drink a lot more beer than I do. But I'm also not enjoying anything with pine or smoke. Ugh.
Well, no smoke here.
This is great. So let's take this Push 88 down to the quiet end and start our story.
Okay. I see that the quiet end is still a virtual quiet end.
Absolutely.
We'll see. Who knows? You think May 1st we're really going to start opening things up again?
Absolutely not.
Probably not.
No.
But we'll wait and see.
Okay. That won't hurt.
As a child, Raynella grew up in a small community outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. Raynella was the second child. She had an older sister named Floanna and 2 younger siblings, Marcus and Robin. Her parents, Dewey and Annie, met in college, and they married after Dewey had enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Annie finished college, Dewey won a Purple Heart, and after the war he continued his education. So Annie worked as a school teacher, and Dewey worked for the U.S. Department of Energy. So he made some good use of his time back in college. He had a master's degree in chemistry and physics, and he was very invested in the safe storage of nuclear waste. Sounds like a smart guy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Raynella grew up in this ideal environment. It was virtually crime-free, and this was a town where she and her siblings could just hop on their bikes anytime, go downtown, see a movie, or use the community swimming pool. It was kind of one of those pre-planned communities for the nuclear power plant scientists. So the kids didn't even know what their parents' position was at the company. But that's pretty much what it all revolved around. But they were also religious. Raynella sang in the choir of the Baptist church. And when she was in elementary school, her classes were segregated. But her high school actually became the first integrated school in the South in 1955. So at least in part because of the large population of these government scientists, Raynella's schools were quite exceptional. The science classes were excellent, of course, and the children began learning a second language by the time they were in the 2nd grade. So it really gave her a lot of advantages in life.
And she was always at the top of her class and was taking all the advanced courses she could. She's also in the marching band, spent her weekends at football games, drive-ins, and other activities common in the 1950s.
Yeah, if you just watch American Graffiti, that was kind of what it was like, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Drinking was less of a problem than in most communities because this county they lived in was completely dry.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's how to combat alcohol.
Well, I mean, if you really want the alcohol, you could drive out of the county and get it.
Well, sure.
But it certainly made it harder on the kids, and a lot of their parents didn't even have booze in the house. Which, I don't know about you, but the first booze I had, I snuck from my parents' liquor cabinet.
Well, that's where you get it, right?
Exactly.
And there's not just the dry county, but a lot of Baptist people, and they don't look at alcohol as that interesting anyway.
No, I think it might be a no-no for them completely. It's certainly not encouraged.
No, definitely not.
So after high school, Raynella went to East Tennessee State University as a nursing student. While there, Raynella got good grades and competed in rifle shooting. Yeah, I know. It's funny when you think about it.
Yeah, I know. Just the way you said that, I'm thinking, oh, here's this student, right, getting the grades. But yeah, she's a marksman.
Yeah, well, it's Tennessee. It's the South, right? And I think there's, more familiarity with guns in the South, or is that just a cliche?
No, I think that's probably true.
Yeah. Well, while she was there, this is when she met her first husband, William Edward Dossett, and he went by Ed. But young Ed had a very different childhood. He had many losses in his life. And I guess the most dramatic, I would say, was his mom's death. This happened on Easter morning, 1956, when little Eddie was just 8 years old. And he woke up in the morning to find his mother on the floor beside his bed, dead of a heart attack. And just 2 months later, his dad died from cancer. So Eddie was an orphan, and he ended up moving in with his aunt and uncle.
That's kind of tough. Little 8-year-old kid, get up in the morning and your mom's dead on the floor.
Can you imagine? Jeez. It's horrible. So he had a much rougher upbringing than Raynella did. But he was just a real go-getter. And as a child, everyone said he was exceptionally kind. In high school, he played some football, but he also worked on the school newspaper. And he was a member of several clubs. Once he was in his senior year, he was given the award for the best school spirit. Then he went to college on a football scholarship, and he continued to date his high school sweetheart in his freshman year. Everyone thought these two would get married, but then he met Raynella at college and broke up with the girlfriend. Not an unusual phenomenon, I guess.
So Ed graduated with a business degree. He and Raynella got married when she was a senior in college. Another story I always liked about Raynella's mom, she didn't approve of Ed, and she apparently knew how to hold a grudge because she didn't speak to Ed for the first 13 years of their marriage.
Well, that's serious grudge holding, right?
I guess so. I really love my mother-in-law. She doesn't talk to me.
But when you look at the big picture, it kind of makes you think, did Raynella get some of that kind of personality from her mom, holding grudges?
Could be.
Well, Ed decided he wanted to be a lawyer, and he started taking classes at the University of Tennessee Law School in 1969. Raynella began working as a nurse after she graduated. In 1972, Ed graduated from law school. He had inherited his family's farm because both of his parents were deceased, so he would call himself a farmer and a country lawyer. But it's funny, he always said, I'm a farmer first and a lawyer second, even though he would really end up being very successful as a lawyer.
He did a good job. He had quite a career.
Absolutely, really popular as well.
Ed worked in criminal law, defending people in need.
Yeah, he liked to help the poor people.
Then in 1978, Raynella gave birth to their first child, Maggie Dossett, and they then moved to the family farm. The young family lived in a mobile home on the property as Ed built their new house. He worked hard. He built the house entirely from lumber from his own trees. He had an architect who designed the home, and he had a contractor friend who advised him on how to do things, but basically he built this place.
So that's pretty impressive to me.
It sure is.
In 1982, when a district attorney general retired, Ed decided to run for that job. And the funny thing is, once he entered the election, his mother-in-law had a change of heart. Suddenly, Ed was an okay guy.
Yeah, he's now worthy of my attention.
Right, which really yuck, right? But she enjoyed this attention, and she would be photographed with him at campaign events as much as possible. But Ed took it in stride, It's my mother-in-law, whatever. I'm going to be nice to everybody. And Raynella was a good wife. She was working really hard to help him with his campaign. So it's not like they were on the outs or anything. The marriage was really good for a long time. And when Ed did win this election, the family celebrated. The local sheriff gave Ed a 5-shot pistol, telling him now he needed a gun to protect himself, because he's putting away bad guys and they might come after him. But Ed wasn't a gun guy. Then the next year, Ed and Raynella had a son, William Edward Dossett Jr., so now the family had Big Eddie and Little Eddie.
Now, Ed had a secretary named Kay, and she was married to a guy named Steve Walker. And the two couples, Kay and Steve and Ed and Raynella, were friendly, and they did some socializing from time to time. When Kay had a son, who they named Kevin, in 1984, she left her position in Ed's office. And Ed and Raynella had a third child, who was named Katie, born in 1985. So Raynella never visited the Walkers, but Ed ended up spending a lot of time there. And you might ask why they spent a lot of time, why he spent a lot of time there. It's because he was screwing Kay.
Well, and I'm just thinking, things must have been not perfect with he and Raynella by then, if he's out having an affair. Or maybe he was just bored, who knows. But Kay was very fond of him, and that's part of the issue. A lot of people think Kay was really in love with Ed, but he wasn't going to leave Raynella, and we don't know if that's because it wouldn't look good, if he was afraid of her maybe, we don't know. But then in 1988, Kay had a second son, who she and her husband named Kyle. And although her husband Steve didn't know about it until years later, Kyle was actually Ed's biological child, a product of this affair, kind of a love child.
We didn't know about birth control, did we?
Well, I'm sure there was some knowledge of it, but who knows? Maybe she wanted to have a baby.
Yeah, but it's kind of nasty to pass it off as her husband's.
Well, I don't know, Dick. I almost think it's kind. Maybe you don't agree with me, but I almost think it's kind of a kind decision. What good is it going to do? They're a family, now they have 2 sons. What good is it if she tells her husband, this son is not biologically yours? And maybe she didn't even know 100%.
That's a possibility.
But I'm just one of these people, I think sometimes, not most of the time, but sometimes holding back a harsh truth can be an act of love. Controversial, but it's how I feel.
Okay, I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay.
Now, in 1990, Raynella retired from nursing, and she concentrated on raising her children and managing the family farm. Dave Leath was a nice man who's a friend of Ed's, and he had a pool. Raynella would take her children into Dave's house to swim in the summer. Other than that, there was really no connection between Raynella and Dave.
Well, they were very different people. She really valued education, and Dave was a high school dropout who worked as a barber. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's a much simpler job than Ed's. Still, Dave was very likable and well known in the community as a good guy.
That same year, Ed started to have stomach pains. Now, he said in a board meeting for local farmers that he had the meanest wife in the world who was trying to kill him. Even though he didn't smile when he said it, everyone still took it as a joke. They all understood that Raynella was a real force. Probably wasn't the easiest woman to live with.
No, what can you say about Raynella? From what we know, she was wearing the pants in her home no matter who she was married to. And you didn't want to cross her. She could hold a grudge just like her mom, I guess. But then tragedy struck in October of 1991 because Ed was admitted into the hospital. He thought it was just for an appendectomy, but during that surgery, adenocarcinoma was found on his appendix and his small intestine. So they did some further exploratory surgery, and they found that he had cancer that had metastasized to several organs. It was just all over his abdomen. So there was no chance of curing him of that. But it was interesting to note that Raynella kept the news of Ed's illness from most people, and people who knew Ed didn't think that was his choice. She did tell a select few people about the cancer, but to everyone else, she just claimed that Ed was recovering from a simple surgery, and he would be back to work, so she told people, lay off, he's going to be fine.
In March of 1992, Ed had a cousin named Elizabeth Perrell. She came down from Illinois to see him, except that Raynella wouldn't let her see him. Actually, she didn't even let her into the house.
I can't even imagine that.
Me either. So then she turned around and went home without ever seeing her cousin Ed. And after she had been home for a few days, she got a letter from Raynella saying that Ed was not well enough to have visitors. Elizabeth was pretty upset about this and disappointed because she knew Ed wanted to see her.
But Raynella was nothing if not controlling. So she was going to control this situation.
She's the force.
There also seemed to be something about her about hiding illness, because it wasn't only with Ed that she did that. So in early June of that year, Ed was still working, and he even managed to get some state and federal funding to create a special DUI unit. Because DUIs had become frighteningly common in Knox County, and offenders were repeating the behavior over and over again before they even made it to court. But still, by July, Ed's health was really going downhill. On July 9th, he was bedridden, and he was on morphine for his pain. So, on the afternoon of July 9th at 3:30, Raynella called 911. She said that Ed had no pulse, and she claimed that he had been trampled by his own cattle. She told the Knox County Sheriff's detective that Ed had wanted to go down and see his cattle, and she said that something must have set off the cattle because Ed was on the ground and the cattle were coming out of the corral when she looked. So Raynella said she did attempt CPR, and she tried to call 911 from her cell phone, but no one had answered. So she'd run back to the house to call for help. But she said when she got to the house, she couldn't remember the phone number for the hospital, which is a little funny because she'd worked at that hospital for years as a director of nursing. But the only number she remembered, according to her, was to the local market. So what she did was she called the clerk at the local market and asked him to call for an ambulance. And when the ambulance showed up, Ed was still in the field and Raynella was next to him. They rushed him to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. Now, it's really sad because he's only 44 years old.
He was.
Yeah, really the prime of his life.
Yep. The whole incident just was incredibly suspicious. People who had seen Ed within a week of his death claimed that he was in and out of consciousness and couldn't even walk on his own. So, how did he get down to the corral to see his cattle?
That's a good question.
Raynella claimed that he had asked to go and see his cattle. So somehow he made his way down there, according to her.
Yeah, or she walked him down there, I don't know.
There's also suspicion about a double indemnity clause in Ed's life insurance policy. If his death was accidental, Raynella would be awarded twice as much money. Some people speculated that Ed would have wanted it that way, but regardless, his death was ruled to be an agricultural accident.
Yeah, so this is interesting because the investigators knew Ed personally, and they believed that Raynella may have taken him out to the field after he had already died. But at the time, they didn't believe that it could have been murder. That didn't even cross their minds, even though Raynella's story really wasn't believable. So this wasn't like the running of the bulls. These were calm cows, and the idea that they would stampede was just ridiculous. But still, investigators decided not to pursue further investigation, mostly because of the respect they had for Ed. So, as the widow of such a well-regarded district attorney, Raynella was pretty much beyond reproach in this community.
It's just a little weird to me. If they don't believe her story, and they figure, well, something's not right here, they didn't pursue it any further?
Well, I think the thought was that maybe Ed wanted to get double the money for his family, and he had planned this, and they didn't want to make a big deal out of it. So they kind of wanted to allow a little bit of insurance fraud, because murder didn't seem to be even in their scope at that point. But the medical examiner convinced Raynella to allow an autopsy because the insurance company would want that in order to confirm his cause of death. Ed's sternum and some of his ribs were fractured, his lungs had hemorrhaged, and of course he had multiple tumors throughout his abdomen. He'd been on a morphine pump for that cancer pain, but that wasn't even mentioned in the autopsy report. He did have abrasions on his arms and his torso, and there was also a mark on his overalls that could have been interpreted as a hoof print, but the cause of death was officially trampled by cattle, even though his injuries didn't really show what it would be if cows were walking on you. And that's just something cows don't do.
I don't think so.
No, I mean, I've spent some time with cows, and they don't walk on a live person unless, they're just penned in and they have no other choice. But it's just not something that would happen.
There's a problem also with the medical examiner, besides maybe overlooking cause of death in Ed.
Oh, that was the minimum.
He did have some ethical problems.
Yeah, putting it nicely.
Now, he had been under scrutiny for years for writing too many narcotic prescriptions. And he had taken a 4-month leave of absence and attended an impaired physician's program because he admitted to having an alcohol and narcotics addiction.
So when it came to Ed's death, Raynella's story varied. She had told a detective that she was so angry with the cattle after finding Ed dead there that she went and got a rifle from the house and shot one of the cows. Now this was just weird. And even weirder, after the police investigated, they couldn't find a cow there that had a gunshot wound. So why would she make up such a strange story?
I don't know. Get her a little sympathy?
I guess. It's just nonsensical.
Yeah. After his funeral, Raynella had Ed buried on the farm. Burial on private property wasn't illegal in Tennessee as long as the property was deemed rural. So that's okay, but Ed's relatives weren't happy with the decision. They thought that Ed wanted to be buried near his mother, and that Raynella had simply disregarded his final wishes.
Yeah, and also many of the people at the house after Ed's funeral believed that Raynella behaved inappropriately. She was very chatty and laughing as if it was any other day. Then when one friend approached her to give his condolences, Raynella shrugged and said, "Well, if he lived, he would have had a lot of operations." So that was just a weird statement.
It sure is.
I mean, above the statement is the whole shrugging it off thing.
Yeah, oh well.
Yeah.
And this is a guy she'd been married to for years.
A long time, sure.
Then, to make opinions of Raynella worse in the town people's eyes, she married Ed's friend, Dave Leath, just 6 months after Ed's death. So she wasn't letting any grass grow under her feet.
No. And this just set off some real problems in the community. So a little bit about Dave. Dave Leath was only 19 years old when he began his career as a barber. He married young, and he had a daughter with his wife Peggy back in 1963. After his boss died, he and a friend took over ownership of the barber shop where they worked, and this was in the West Hills area of Knoxville. Dave liked to work on cars and go to watch stock car races, and he was a really doting father to his daughter Cindy, but not an ideal husband. In 1970, his wife Peggy learned that he was having an affair, and she filed for divorce. Then later that year, Dave had a really serious eye injury. He was chopping wood when a splinter flew into his eye. And when he finally went to the doctor, his eye was very painful and swollen. He was one of these guys that waited and waited before he went to a doctor, saying, "Oh, it'll get better." And when he was finally seen, he was diagnosed with a detached retina, and the doctor told him he's never going to see out of that eye again.
Yeah, because he waited too long.
Yes. And so after that, the eye atrophied, and this was something that Dave would be forever self-conscious about. He began wearing sunglasses almost all the time, and if he didn't have them on, he'd keep his eyes down. He just didn't want people to notice it.
Right, well, he was pretty aware of his physical appearance. He wanted to look good. He worked out regularly. He had hair implants. He had a facelift. And he had a tummy tuck.
So he's not your typical plastic surgery patient.
He sure
a barber
isn't.
from Tennessee, a man, right?
Yeah, and a high school dropout, right?
Yeah, but he did care about his looks.
He sure did. So he remarried in 1979, And he built this new house with a swimming pool. This is where Raynella would take the kids. But one day Dave came home and found his second wife, Debbie, not there. Not only was Debbie not there, the furniture was not there, and Debbie's belongings were not there. Debbie had left him, but she was in love with another man.
Yeah, so Dave really went through a tough time after Debbie left, and he drank more than he should have. But he had maintained a good relationship with his daughter, Cindy. When Cindy married in 1982, he was there to walk her down the aisle. Then in 1990, Cindy had a son. She named him Tyler, and this was a big deal to Dave. He adored Tyler, and Tyler became a big part of Dave's life. Over school vacations, when Cindy had to work, Dave would take care of his grandson full-time.
Dave had been a pallbearer at Ed Dossett's funeral, and just a few months after Ed's death, August of 1992, Dave asked Raynella to go out on a date with him. And then a few months later, Dave told his family and friends that he and Raynella were going to get married. A little bit of a shock to his circle of friends. They warned him that it was too soon after Ed's death, and it gave the impression that he and Raynella had been seeing each other before Ed died.
Well, yeah, I think the common response was, Ed's not even cold yet. The body's still warm.
And you're moving in on him.
Yes. But, I have to kind of think that Raynella was more of the aggressor here, just by looking at the two people and their personalities.
Possibly.
But Raynella did have 3 kids who were still living in the home, and that was a lot for Dave to take on. But he was clearly in love with Raynella. He signed a prenuptial agreement to protect her property, and they married in January of 1993, and this is just 6 months after Ed died.
So Dave sold his house, moved into the house that Ed Dossett had built, and at first it seemed that Raynella and Dave were in love and cared for each other. Dave built a greenhouse for Raynella, and she bought him a fancy customized pickup truck with a horse trailer. They were seen holding hands, and they had only good things to say about one another. But Dave's daughter Cindy was beginning to see signs of trouble after a couple years of marriage. One time she found her father crying in his truck, but he assured her that he and Raynella were going to work things out.
Yeah, so back around this time, 1993, things with the medical examiner, Randall Pedigo, had gotten worse.
This is the guy who did Ed's autopsy.
Yes, and did kind of a shitty job and had some ethical issues.
Had some problems with narcotics.
Well, yeah, but things got worse. He wasn't any longer prescribing narcotics, but now he had ordered huge amounts of Versed. So Versed, that's a drug that's usually used before medical procedures or surgery. It relieves anxiety, it makes you sleepy, and also you don't remember anything, right?
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, I've had Versed a couple times. You have too.
Yeah, before surgery.
Right. What a wonderful drug.
Well, when used correctly, yes, it does work well. But it turned out that this medical examiner was inviting teen boys to his home, injecting them with the drug, telling them he was giving them a hepatitis B vaccine, things like that, but then taking advantage of them sexually. He was eventually found guilty and removed from his position, but still no concerns were raised about Ed Dossett's autopsy.
That seems separate from this guy.
Yeah, but, this is part of his work.
Yeah, true. So in December of 1994, Raynella's daughter Maggie was 15 years old, and she drove the family's pickup truck with her 11-year-old brother, Eddie, in the passenger seat. At an intersection less than a mile from the farm, Maggie failed to yield to another car and drove into a car. Eddie wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and he was ejected out of the passenger side window. Unfortunately for Maggie, she was on a learner's permit, so she was supposed to have a licensed driver with her when she was driving. And according to the accident report, Raynella was in the passenger seat, but she wasn't. A first responder at the scene knew that Raynella was not in the truck. As soon as she heard about the accident, she rushed to the scene and lied to protect her daughter. A neighbor who was one of the first people to arrive at the scene said Raynella wasn't there. Another woman saw the crash and recognized the truck, and she's the one who drove up to the farm to bring Raynella to the scene of the accident.
Right, so even though all these people know it's a lie, they're letting it go again. And this is the pattern, which I think is important in this story. When asked why she didn't tell the police that Raynella was lying, the neighbor said that he was actually afraid of her. He also thought that the police would never believe him. He was a black farmer, and she was a wealthy white prosecutor's widow. So it's sad, but probably true, that nobody was going to care what he said.
You're right.
So all of those involved in the accident were taken to the hospital, and the driver of the other car was in critical condition. Raynella, no surprise, had no injuries. Maggie was treated for minor injuries and released the same day. But tragically, little Eddie died from his injuries. So Dave and Raynella were both pretty devastated. Eddie's sister Katie was very distraught also. But Maggie, who caused the accident, appeared unmoved by her little brother's death. So he's gone, and he was buried on the farm next to his dad. So we have little Eddie and Big Ed.
Side by side.
Side by side. So it's really tragic, and you could feel some sympathy for Raynella.
You can, yeah.
She certainly didn't want to lose her son, no matter what you think of her.
No, she didn't. Now, a month later, the district attorney recommended that the other driver have charges brought against him because he had been driving without a license following a previous DUI, and they didn't want any charges filed against Maggie Dossett. But the Tennessee Highway Patrol didn't agree with this, and in February of 1995, Maggie was charged for failing to yield. The prosecutor took the case to juvenile court, and it was dismissed from there. Many people believe that Maggie had been given preferential treatment because she was a Dossett.
So shortly after Eddie died, Steve Walker found out that his son Kyle was Ed Dossett's biological child. Kay had taken him out to dinner and told him she was in love with another man and she wanted a divorce. She didn't tell him about Kyle that evening, but in their subsequent custody battle, Kay's lawyer said that Kyle was the biological son of Ed Dossett. And this was pretty stupid, because Steve didn't really care. I mean, Kyle was still Steve's son, and he willingly paid child support. Didn't treat him any differently than his older son. This was the first time, though, that Steve knew about Kay and Ed's affair, but he would later believe that Raynella had known about it from the very beginning. In April of 1995, Steve Walker got a call from a friend of Raynella, and she told him that Raynella wanted to talk to him and asked him would he please come out to the farm. Once there, in Raynella's kitchen, the two talked for about 2 hours, and Raynella told him that she knew Kyle was Ed's son, and then the two discussed their former partner's infidelity. Less than a week later, Raynella showed up at Steve's work. This was about 11 a.m., so shortly before lunch, and she told him that she had found some stuff that proved his children were both Ed's. She said that Ed had hidden some papers in the barn related to his affair and related to the paternity of the children.
Yeah, so Steve got into Raynella's car and rode to the farm with her. As they pulled into the yard, they saw Raynella's mother out working in the garden. They chatted for a minute, and Raynella told her mother that she was taking Steve to the barn to show him something. Then, according to Steve, as they drove past Ed's grave, Raynella stopped the car and said to Steve, "I'm sure you're mad at Ed. If you want to piss on his grave, I'll turn my head and let you do it. I wouldn't blame you."
So weird. I mean, Steve thought that was super weird. And he said, well, no, I'd never do anything like that. Then once at the barn, Raynella pointed to a bucket and told Steve the papers were in there. But when he went over to the bucket, it was just full of paint. When he turned back around, he saw that Raynella had wrapped a towel around her hand and was holding a revolver. Then she went ahead and fired at him twice, shouting that she would kill him and Kay, and she would raise the son. Now, really miraculously, Steve wasn't hit, and he ran away through some woods out into a pasture. Remember, he's way out in the country, and he doesn't have a vehicle.
He doesn't.
But then he heard Raynella's car driving at him across a field, and when she reached him, she fired the gun again. She missed him, but then she got close to him. He had fallen down, and she aimed the gun at his head. She said that she couldn't miss him from there. But when she pulled the trigger again, the gun just clicked. She was out of bullets.
Good thing for Steve.
Super lucky.
Then according to Steve, at that point, Raynella's demeanor completely changed. She said she would get something to wrap for his sprained ankle, told him to come up to the house, and they could talk things over. Steve said that he didn't trust her. She needed to leave the gun. And she did. She left the gun on the fence post. So when Raynella walked back toward her car, Steve grabbed the gun and ran.
Well, certainly she had plans to kill him when they got back to the house.
You think?
I think so. So he wasn't stupid. He took off.
So when he stopped at a nearby house, no one was home. Then he hid in a culvert as Raynella drove past looking for him.
So that's like a movie, right?
Yeah.
It's just terrifying.
She didn't find him. She drove into town and visited his ex-wife, Kay. While Steve was still hiding, Kay called their children's daycare center and told the owner, "Don't let Steve pick up our kids. He'd gone crazy."
Yeah, so we don't know what Raynella told Kay, but she apparently believed her. Finally, Steve found a mobile home where an older couple answered the door. He asked to use their phone, and he called a friend to come and pick him up. Now, I personally would have called the police immediately. But his friend called the sheriff's office, and deputies were sent out to Raynella's farm to investigate this whole incident. Before they even showed up, though, Raynella had already called and reported that Steve had stolen her gun. So she's trying to get to them first.
She's a little proactive here.
Yes. But she had a totally different story from Steve. Still, the deputies were able to put together what had really happened. Raynella was charged with attempted murder. She did surrender to the police, but she was released that same night on $10,000 bail. So Steve was terrified. The whole time she's out, he's afraid she's going to come and kill him.
Well, he's got to feel like he just dodged a huge thing.
A literal bullet.
He's on the ground. She's aiming the gun at his head. He's dead.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly would have been.
Yep.
I don't know what her story would have been for that one. But it seems like she was just in some kind of rage and maybe didn't even care at that point. But when she later appeared in court, her attorney filed for a dismissal of the charges. When Steve testified to what happened that day at the farm, Raynella just shook her head and rolled her eyes like, "Oh, please." But Steve had been terrified the whole time she was out on bail. He'd actually been sleeping in a chair with a gun that he bought for protection in case she came back for him.
Yikes. So in January of 1996, Raynella was indicted by a grand jury. 2 weeks before her trial date, they reached a plea agreement. Raynella agreed to plead guilty to assault if the attempted murder charge was dropped. So she got 6 years probation and 100 hours of community service. And at the end of her probation, assuming that she didn't do anything else, the charge would be dropped and removed from her record.
Well, this sentence was just shockingly lenient.
That it is.
Nobody else would have gotten that. Imagine if the positions had been changed and Steve had shot at her. He would have been in prison for life, I bet. I mean, not only is she wealthy and older and all that, she's a woman. So for all these reasons, I think she was just treated with kid gloves. But of course, this whole thing was a big relief for Dave Leath, who's her husband and is trying to deal with all these legal issues. After that, he was happy to be busy again cutting hair during the day and doing all his other projects during his off time. And that August, the couple destroyed their prenuptial agreement and they signed new wills with their attorney.
Yeah, in Dave's will, Raynella was named the executrix, and his new will disinherited Cindy and left nothing to his grandkids. Raynella's going to get everything. When Dave's mother died, Raynella would also inherit the family home and property. Pretty good deal for Raynella.
Yeah. Well, in the late 90s, things seemed to be getting easier for Dave. The stepdaughters were getting older and one of them went off to college. But then in January of 2000, Dave was ill. He was having hallucinations and delirium so bad that he was hospitalized. An MRI showed that he had suffered a mini stroke. He also had high cholesterol and he had herpes simplex encephalitis. So what can you tell us about those conditions?
Well, encephalitis is a brain infection, and herpes is one of those nice viruses that causes all sorts of problems. It would certainly explain his hallucinations and delirium. And it's potentially fatal.
So is there treatment? Can
Yeah,
it be fixed?
You can treat with antiviral drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And then the cholesterol, everyone knows about that.
Sure.
So we're going to follow diet, exercise, medication for that.
But what about the mini stroke? I mean, that can make you confused, but does it make you hallucinate?
No, that's the encephalitis.
Okay. Well, when Dave's family visited him in the hospital, Raynella was angry and she told Cindy, his daughter, that she'd call her with anything that she needed to know. Otherwise, beat it.
Yeah, I'll take care of this.
But on March 1st, Raynella went to Cremation Options and she met with the owner there. She told him that her husband was sick and she prepaid for his cremation as well as her own. Dave retired from barbering and his daughter Cindy took over his chair. Cindy said that he didn't seem all that confused. He seemed okay, but he had retired because he had an enlarged prostate, and it was so bad that it required him to self-catheterize himself every day. But still, Dave visited often at the barber shop. He continued to work out, and he continued to go into the tanning bed at the Y because he still wanted to look good.
Geez, medically, this guy's a mess, isn't he? He's got cholesterol problems, he's had a stroke, he's got a encephalitis, which should have been treated. He's got a hypertrophic prostate, needs to catheterize.
He's dealing with a lot, sure.
Now, on March 8th, he was readmitted to the hospital. Raynella said that he was having short-term memory issues. She added that he was very emotional and had a temper. Dave told the neurologist who he saw that he believed Raynella was trying to kill him by smothering him. But the doctor believed that Dave was demented and paranoid.
So it's hard to really say what was going on here.
Yeah, it is. This could have been the result of the stroke, could have been the result of the encephalitis, could be a combination of the two.
It could also be Raynella.
Could also be Raynella.
When Dave followed up with the neurologist in late March, his memory was better, and he seemed to be in a better mood, and he was talking about activities that he was planning to do. Then in September of 2002, Raynella's record was expunged and she was off probation. So now it's as if the conviction never happened. She's got no record. Then Dave went to see the neurologist in October, and he was much more stable and he seemed clear-headed. On his next appointment, though, in January of 2003, Dave was crying and he was expressing a lot of frustration. He said he had a hard time verbalizing what he wanted to, and he had pretty much just stopped talking altogether. So his illness really wasn't typical of Alzheimer's disease, but the doctor did suspect that as a possibility.
Well, yeah, that's probably just kind of throwing out a diagnosis because he didn't have an idea what was going on.
Well, yeah, and I would even consider that he was being drugged.
That's a possibility.
It's possible.
You've got kind of ups and downs symptom-wise. So later that month, Raynella went to the hospital in order to have a hysterectomy. She told Dave, "You can drop me off, but I don't want you to visit me."
Weird.
Then when he went to pick her up the next day, he learned that she had underwent actually a double mastectomy, as well as a hysterectomy, because she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. Dave was pretty shocked and upset that Raynella hadn't told him this.
Well, this is a very big
Right.
deal, right?
Yeah.
A double mastectomy is a huge surgery, plus just the emotional side of that, and the fact that she had cancer. So she was very weird when it came to diseases and illness.
Wasn't she?
Yeah. But she'd started making notations in her appointment book about Dave's daily moods and his behavior. And in February, Dave's mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. For some unknown reason, Raynella told Dave's relatives that she was only in the hospital for a minor procedure and she didn't have cancer. So here we go again.
Yeah. She does have some issues with medicine, right?
And with honesty.
So Cindy spoke to her dad on the phone on March 10th. On the 12th, Dave got together with a friend and they made plans to haul a load of mulch the next day. At that time, when he was with the friend, he seemed completely oriented and in a really good mood.
So the following morning, around 9:30, Raynella went to the hospital with flowers for her mother-in-law. Now, mind you, she'd never gone to visit her alone before. Normally, she'd let Dave visit his mother alone. She might even wait out in the car. But that day she was seen on more than one of the hospital floors, almost like she wanted to be seen.
Right. And the other thing that was unusual was Cindy got a call from Raynella that same morning. And Raynella asked if Cindy had seen her father. She hadn't. So Cindy asked if something was wrong, and Raynella told her that he hadn't eaten his breakfast, and she didn't want him working out at the YMCA on an empty stomach.
But there's no reason for her to believe that Cindy would have seen him.
No.
When she'd left the house, he was there.
Yeah, there wouldn't be any reason necessarily for Cindy to go see him.
So at 11:23 a.m., less than 2 hours after that, Raynella was calling 911 from the farm. Dave was dead in his bed from a gunshot wound to his head. But 3 shots had been fired, which made investigators suspicious. It wasn't impossible, but it was very unusual.
To say the least.
Dave's daughter Cindy and Dave's cousin Frida arrived at the farm. Raynella talked to them. She talked about his suicide, his depression, and his dementia. But none of this matched what Cindy had seen with her dad. Dave's friends and family just didn't believe that he had shot himself. For one thing, Dave hated guns, and he was afraid of them. His father had taken him hunting when he was younger, but he really never shot any animals. He was also so proud of his looks. He wouldn't have wanted to be found like that.
No, not with gunshot wounds to his head.
And another weird thing is that Dave was right-handed, but he had apparently shot himself with his left hand above his left eye, which was blind.
Yeah, that's the eye with the detached retina, right?
Yes, yep.
So the medical examiner determined that Dave's death was not a suicide. When Raynella held Dave's memorial service, people were shocked that he'd been cremated, because Dave had believed that cremation was wrong, and cremated people could not go to heaven. So and the suspicions grew even more when they found out that Raynella had driven to the crematorium and paid for the cremation before he died.
So after Dave's death, authorities did begin to investigate the cattle trampling death of her first husband, Ed Dossett. The new medical examiner reviewed the toxicology report from Ed's autopsy and concluded that he actually died from an overdose of morphine, not from a cattle stampede. At the time of his death, Ed was taking a lot of morphine for his pain for his cancer, but he had a lethal dose of morphine in his bloodstream. The injuries that were supposed to be from cattle hooves were non-fatal, and the broken sternum and ribs were believed to have happened during resuscitation attempts. So charges were obtained for the murder of Ed Dossett, but first Raynella was going to be prosecuted for the murder of her second husband, Dave Leath.
So Raynella's living the life here, huh? She's going to be charged with 2 murders, and she was charged with attempted murder, although those charges were reduced with the plea agreement.
Well, and they're totally dropped as if they didn't exist at this point.
Right. So in April, Dave's mother was moved to a nursing home. Now, Raynella seemed to be constantly at her side, and she wouldn't allow Cindy or Cindy's kids to visit. Raynella told the nurses that only medical staff and she would be allowed in the room. But the next day, before Dave's mother was transferred to another nursing home, she died. Cindy thought this was really strange, and even given the other circumstances, gave some consideration that Raynella might have killed her grandmother, Dave's mother.
Yeah, and there's no proof of that, but it is a little weird, isn't it?
Certainly is.
On April 21st, Raynella asked Cindy to meet her in the lawyer's office, and the lawyer told Cindy that her father's original will was missing. For over 30 years, he made it his normal practice to have the original kept by the client and to keep a copy in his office. But now Raynella was saying that she couldn't find the original. So the lawyer read Dave's will out loud, and Cindy learned that she and her children had been excluded completely. She couldn't believe her dad would leave the family property to Raynella and not his grandchildren. So Raynella was the only person who was benefiting financially from Dave's death. So of course that just made suspicions grow.
Absolutely. So in the summer of 2003, subpoenas were issued for evidence for a grand jury, but nothing happened. And in 2005, Dave Leath's homicide was still an open case. Cindy was in the belief that Raynella's social standing and wealth were protecting her. And she called Steve Walker to talk about the day when Raynella had tried to kill him. And he told Cindy, "Leave this alone, or your life would be in danger."
Yeah, this Steve Walker's kind of funny. We saw him on a 48 Hours episode about this, and it was kind of funny the way he told the story, even though it was so serious. But he certainly thought that Raynella was a dangerous person.
He certainly did.
He certainly did. So Cindy wrote a letter to the DA about her father's case. A Knoxville paper reported that, after a month, Cindy still had received no reply. So they met with Cindy and the investigators involved, but still nothing new was done. So let's go to 2006, and Cindy filed a civil lawsuit against Raynella, claiming that she had killed Dave Leath, or she had hired someone to kill him.
But she is responsible for his death.
Right, exactly. But she didn't ask for compensation. It was just an attempt to void Raynella's inheritance of the family property. And the court decided that if Raynella was found criminally responsible for Dave's death, then she would have to forfeit her inheritance.
So in November 2006, an indictment was issued charging Raynella with the premeditated homicide of David Leath. Raynella was freed on bail of $5,000, and no court date was set.
So it still seems like they're being awfully lenient with her. She's indicted for premeditated murder. And $5,000 bail with no court date in the near future?
Yeah.
I mean, $5,000 was nothing to her. She was very well off. So I don't know where she was getting such favoritism, but it certainly seems that she was.
Oh, absolutely.
In December, the court ruled that Dave's new will wasn't valid, so his only child, Cindy, would receive half of the estate.
Yeah, then in September 2007, Raynella entered a not guilty plea in criminal court. She went to trial in March 2009 for the murder of David Leath. A mistrial was declared when the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Final count actually was 11 for conviction and 1 for not guilty.
So she came close there.
She came close.
So they had a trial a second time in January of 2010. The medical examiner testified that Dave was shot once in the forehead above his left eye. That was his blind eye. The shot was fired from 12 to 14 inches away, she testified. And she told the jury that toxicology testing showed a mixture of 4 medications in his system that left him too weak to get out of bed. So she concluded that Dave Leath was unable to kill himself or even defend himself. It was impossible for Mr. Leath to have shot himself, the ME testified. Mr. Leath was incapacitated. She was unable to determine a precise time of death, but she estimated that he had died sometime after 6 a.m. on the day his body was found.
Now, the lead police investigator was Sergeant Perry Moyers, and he testified there had been no fingerprints found on the gun. So he concluded that would be highly unlikely if Dave had committed suicide.
Yeah, and if he'd had to try 3 times, why wouldn't his fingerprints be on that gun?
Should have been. And Sergeant Moyers also testified that Dave's body appeared to have been tucked into the bed where he was found. And the clothes dryer was running when officers arrived at the scene. So this suggested that Raynella may have changed her clothes after she shot her husband in order to get rid of blood or gunshot residue.
Well, she certainly had the opportunity to.
Right.
The defense presented evidence that on the day of Dave's death, Raynella's youngest daughter, Katie, left for high school at 8:20 a.m. Raynella and Dave had then watched televangelist Joyce Meyer on TV. Raynella then made breakfast for Dave and put clothes in the dryer before she left home. But that would not explain why the dryer was still running when police came. It was determined by phone records that Raynella had called Cindy at 9:50 a.m. that morning to tell her that she was visiting Dave's mother at the hospital. She then told Cindy that she was concerned that Dave may have gone to the gym without eating his breakfast. But when you think about it, this call was made just 20 minutes after she left the house, so that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't.
The defense actually presented evidence from the hospital personnel confirming that Raynella was at the hospital at that time. But Raynella had said she left Dave at home with his breakfast on a bedside table. So why would she even think that Cindy would have seen him? Plus, just visiting her mother-in-law was very odd. This was the first time and the only time that Raynella had ever called Cindy at work, too.
So nothing she's done that morning is in character for her.
No, it all seems like she's trying to create an alibi.
Yes. So Raynella had taken some medication to the high school after she left the hospital. Katie had called to tell her that she wasn't feeling well. So records at the high school confirmed that Raynella had stopped at the school to deliver the medicine, and she left at 10:45 in the morning. She stopped to talk to a neighbor after she parked in her driveway. Then she went into the house and found her husband's body. 911 call came in at 11:23 in the morning.
Well, the jury never heard about Ed Dossett's death or Steve Walker's attempted murder because that wasn't allowed. The prosecution said that Raynella had drugged her husband the night before, shot him after Katie left for school, and then positioned the gun on the bed, trying to make it look like a suicide. Then she'd gone off and spent the rest of the morning developing her alibi. So on January 25, 2010, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Raynella of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Then, the prosecution dismissed the charges against her for murdering her first husband. I guess they just thought they didn't need to bother with that.
Well, I guess. I mean, she's got life in prison.
Sure.
And it was an older case. Maybe less of a case to present to a jury.
Maybe.
So,
I mean, her lawyers filed a motion for a new trial, but that was denied. But then, in 2013, another appeal was denied. In 2015, Raynella was represented by a new defense team, and they filed a petition for post-conviction relief, and they sought a new trial. So their position was based on medical records that were not entered as evidence at her trial. These records would have shown that Dave had been diagnosed with dementia back in 2002. He had been prescribed medications, but his condition had still been deteriorating. 1 month before Dave's death, his neurologist had noted that he was having increased mood swings, memory loss, and feelings of frustration and inadequacy. The petition also mentioned that after Raynella's conviction, a former sheriff's deputy told a defense investigator that when he arrived at the house after Dave's body was discovered, he saw a police officer walk out of the house carrying the gun that had killed Dave. So this had happened before crime scene technicians had arrived on the scene, and this statement called into question the prosecutor's claim at trial that the gun had been placed on the bed in a way that looked staged. Now, this deputy later recanted his statement but gave no reason for that change.
Interesting. So the petition also claimed that the deputy's original story had been confirmed by another witness, a paramedic who was a first responder. The paramedic gave a statement, a sworn statement, that before any crime scene technicians were on the scene, he saw a deputy holding a gun, and he heard another deputy say that the weapon was removed and secured. So the defense's petition also included evidence from a professor of pathology who read the ME's autopsy report and reviewed the toxicology results. The professor's conclusion was that the medications in Dave's bloodstream were within the therapeutic range, which meant that Dave couldn't have been drugged by his wife the night before his death, and he wouldn't have been incapacitated by the medication.
So that's a big deal. And another important part of the defense's petition was the fact that the trial judge had been under the influence of narcotics during the trial. The judge was later convicted on state and federal charges relating to his addiction and abuse of OxyContin. The petition showed that from December 30th, 2009 to January 25th, 2010, this is the time period of Raynella's second trial, the judge was prescribed at least 150 OxyContin pills by one doctor. But that's not all. At the time, he was also getting more OxyContin from various court staff and even from drug dealers. So this really messed things up.
Yeah, to me that's a lot more of a problem than where the gun was.
Well, sure. I think that was probably what really put things over the top. Because she was granted a new trial in May of 2016 based on the judge being impaired by drug use during her trial, and she was released on bail pending her new trial. Now, why was she released on bail? Because I've heard of many people who have to stay in prison waiting for their new trial.
Well,
I just think she got a lot of favoritism.
Getting back to her being the wife of an attorney and upper class, white.
Woman, all these things, yeah.
So the prosecution prosecuted Raynella again in 2017. They had evidence including a blood spatter expert who testified that Dave was not lying in the bed, but was actually in a sitting position when he was shot. The defense insisted that the evidence showed Dave had shot himself. The defense attorney had the bed and headboard brought into the courtroom, where he demonstrated how Dave could have missed with the first shot, killed himself with the second, and the third shot was from a post-mortem spasm.
So this was a lot of drama, bringing in the bed, the blood-stained mattress, acting it out, asking an expert, could this have happened? But to me, it's just a lot to believe that all this happened. He missed, he shot himself, but then somehow his hand spasmed and shot a third shot? Hard to believe.
Certainly is. To me it is.
But a lot of that would still be questioned. To the prosecution, the revolver used to kill Dave Leath was really critical. A former Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent took the stand for the defense to explain the evidence. So a picture of the open revolver cylinder from the crime scene showed that the 3 fired rounds had hammer strikes in the middle of the bullet casings, so little dents that you could see. And the other rounds didn't have those marks because they hadn't been shot. But there's a clockwise rotation of the revolver cylinder that would show you the order of the shots. So the first 2 cartridges were from silver Remington bullets, and those 2 were found in the wall and in Dave's head. The third was a gold Winchester bullet, and that's the one that was found in the mattress, which was believed to be the third shot. So this meant that the third shot had been fired after Dave's brain stem had been severed by the second shot. The medical examiner said that was impossible for Dave to have pulled the trigger on the third shot because he'd just shot himself in the head. But the defense would argue that. Surprisingly, there are multiple shot suicides that do happen. The defense attorney's demonstration of how the death could have been a suicide contradicted the ME's testimony. But the defense brought up at trial that there was no way to be certain that the revolver cylinder hadn't been opened or turned, which would have meant the order couldn't be determined and that would be irrelevant. So the defense did come up with some good arguments.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know how you can argue that there's no way to be certain the cylinder hadn't been opened or turned. If you're trying to make it a suicide, there's no reason for it to have been opened or turned.
Right, but you really can't prove that that didn't happen.
I know, but you can use your common sense.
Sure, you're right, that's true.
So also in the third trial, the medical examiner maintained that his death was a homicide, but she was no longer able to testify that the medications in his system were incapacitating. So this would explain why Dave was in a sitting position when he was shot. If it's a homicide, he would have heard the first shot and sat up to defend himself.
So that makes sense to me.
It does. Then what about Raynella's call to Cindy on the morning of Dave's death?
Yeah, that's really weird because she never called Cindy. It's not like they were friendly. So when someone changes their behavior like that, that's a real red flag to me.
It certainly is.
She'd never called Cindy at work before. Never. And she'd never visited her mother-in-law in the hospital before. Also, she called Cindy so soon after she left the farm, like 20 minutes. So it does sound like she was putting together some kind of alibi.
It does. So after closing statements, the jurors had been given instructions for their deliberations. The defense made a motion to dismiss the charges for lack of evidence. This is something that happens pretty much every murder trial.
Sure. I mean, they stand up and they do that, right?
Yeah. And pretty much always the judges rule against it. Not this time. In a real shocker, the judge agreed that the prosecution had a lack of sufficient evidence and had failed to meet its burden. So the judge acquitted Raynella.
Right, so that's it.
And that's it. She's not going to get charged again.
So the prosecution and Dave's family members are just stunned and angry. And after this acquittal, the finding of not guilty was final. I mean, there's no appeal. There's no way to change that.
Nope, she's a free woman.
So this judge was Paul Summers, And he found that even if Dave Leath did not commit suicide, there was no evidence that Raynella was in the house when the 3 shots were fired. Also, there was no motive, and the prosecution, he said, had no time of death established. So in an interview with Erin Moriarty on the 48 Hours TV show, Judge Summers said that if he was the prosecutor, he wouldn't have taken this case to trial because there wasn't enough evidence. And he said he was concerned that jurors might be swayed by emotion and make the wrong decision, so it was his job to acquit her.
All I can say is wow.
Yeah, I feel pretty certain that she killed him.
Well, the evidence certainly looks that way. And this is the 3rd trial. So one trial, the mistrial, was 11-1 in favor of her being guilty. She is convicted in the 2nd trial, 12-0, and had this trial going on. So I don't know why the judge felt like he wouldn't have brought it to trial and acquitted her. I think it should have gone to the jury.
Well, the jury would agree with you. A few members of the jury were interviewed in that 48 Hours episode, and they were upset that it was taken away from them, and they all believed she was guilty, too. So maybe there was some emotion based on that. I mean, the evidence wasn't ironclad.
No, it wasn't, but I think the explanation for the bullets, gunshots that had been fired, to me is more indicative of a homicide than a suicide.
Yes, and her behavior that morning.
Yeah.
Very questionable.
So maybe they'll reopen the original case of the first husband.
It's possible, but I don't know. I mean, she's in her 60s now, and Ed's family really isn't advocating for that, so I don't know if it'll ever happen. But our sources for this case were the National Registry of Exonerees. That is a summary of her case put together by Maurice Posley in June of 2017. There's the 48 Hours episode I referenced, titled The Widow on Solway Road, from July 2018. There's a book by Diane Fanning, titled Her Deadly Web. There is also quite a bit in the Knox News Online archives. TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. So my least favorite part of the show are these businessy updates, but I know you have a couple things to say, so let's do that before we go to feedback.
Okay. So the first thing is, and some of you may have noticed, that the newsletter got published recently. This is the quarterly newsletter. Second one, we did one in January, and this one just a day or 2 ago. It goes over some things to keep your mind occupied while we're quarantined. Some good true crime things to look in on. Nice little article written by one of our listeners about interviewing a murderer.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of it.
Next one will be in July.
Yeah, so this is sent to anyone who went on our website and signed up to get the newsletter. And if you signed up and you haven't received it, check your spam or junk folder because that's probably where it is. It was sent out last Wednesday, and I checked on Thursday and only about half of the people had opened it. So it's a possibility it's in your junk folder. Also, our beer review contest is coming to an end.
I think I'll do another week or so, and then I'll get into May and make a decision about who's got the one I like.
Okay, so you want to give it to May 10th?
So I would hope that any submissions will be by the end of April 30th, and then I'll take a week or so to listen to them all again and pick a winner.
Okay, and then we'll play the winner on an episode.
We'll play the winner on an episode probably somewhere in the middle of May.
And if I can find a case to do that would match the beer's location, we'll do that so we can just use the listener's review for the episode. Give you a break.
We could try that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you interested in getting some extra ad-free episodes of TCB and supporting the show? If you are, it's cheap and easy. Wasn't that your nickname in high school, Dick? Cheap and easy?
Well, actually, no. It was easy, yes, but it was also expensive.
Okay. Our commercial-free members-only episodes come out every month, plus there's a huge backlog of over 40 episodes that are all yours to listen to as soon as you sign up, and you can be a Tie Grabber member for as little as $4 a month. Also, when you join, we're going to send you a Welcome to the Brewery gift with a handwritten note because we do appreciate our subscribers very much. If you're interested at all, just go to our website, tiegrabber.com, and click on subscribe to learn more. So we're moving on to feedback. If you happen to have a case suggestion or some comments about a crime or even a beer, we encourage you to send us a voicemail. We have a widget on our website. It's on the right side of the screen. You can click on that and record your message, or record it on your phone and send it to us in an email. If you're too shy for either of those, please send us an email with your comments or suggestions to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. So what did you bring us for feedback today?
I got some emails from people. All the voicemails that have come in recently have been beer reviews.
Which is wonderful.
Which is great. I truly appreciate that, but I don't have any voicemails in terms of comments or case suggestions. So we'll go with emails.
Okay, so the first one is a case suggestion from Christine. And Christine writes, there's a lot of just praise here.
Well, okay.
I have suggestions for you guys if you haven't already covered it. It's the case of Kim Need, a 17-year-old girl from Poplar, Montana. She was found brutally murdered in 1979 at a popular teenager hangout spot by Poplar River. Barry Beach, a 17-year-old neighbor boy, was eventually prosecuted and sentenced to 100 years for this crime after confessing to her murder, as well as the murders of 3 other women. Beach claimed that he was forced into confession by local police and continues to maintain his innocence for 35 years now. He was eventually released in 2014 and has since been suspected of other crimes. There are several suspicions involving this case, and I hope it interests you, but I just want to say thank you for all your hard work, and I look forward to listening to you guys every week. Thank you, Christine.
It's an interesting case, and there's a lot of literature to look at it, so I think we'll consider this.
Sure, it sounds like a good one. I really would like to do more cases where the guilt is questionable, where there's a little bit more of a mystery to it.
Yeah, that's certainly one thing. And then if you've been professing your innocence for 30-some years, why would you get in trouble with the law when you finally do get released?
Yes, right.
I think it'd be an incentive to go straight.
That's something to think about, sure.
But we'll look into that.
Absolutely. So the second email is case suggestion from Casey.
Yeah, Casey had written us actually twice. There's a YouTube request and just a general email request. And I was looking at her email and thinking this would be a good one to publish, and then she left the YouTube one. So succinctly, Casey said, do an episode on Peter Curtin and Mikhail Popkov.
All right, so what's with this? What's the story?
So they're both serial killers. One from about 100 years ago and one from 5 or 10 years ago. So they're, other than being serial killers, they're not related to each other. Peter Curtin was convicted of killing and sexually assaulting several women in Dusseldorf, Germany in 1929. He was also called the Vampire of Dusseldorf because he drank their blood.
Ew.
So he was charged, convicted, and killed. He was beheaded on the guillotine. Don't have too many people that go to the guillotine.
No, that's a new one.
Yeah.
For our show, certainly, yeah.
And Mikhail Popkov was a Russian guy, and he was convicted in the murders of 78 women.
Wow.
And that's probably an underestimate.
Really?
Now,
how can you kill that many people and not get caught sooner?
I don't know.
That's just terrifying.
Now, he was sentenced to life in prison because the Russian justice system doesn't allow for executions. And his cute little nickname was the werewolf.
Why was that?
Just because he because of some of the things he did to the dead bodies.
Ugh. All right. Well, thanks, Casey. Those are some suggestions I've never heard of before. Very original. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll look into those.
Absolutely. So what else do you have to say today, Dick? Any advice for people from your wise mind?
Keep your distance.
Sounds good. Well, I hope everyone is safe and doing well. And we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
We'll be there.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.